Welcome to the Professional Doctorate in Fine Art and the Professional Doctorate in Design. In the first 5 lectures of this series, we want to present you with a theory of research in the creative areas. This theory is underpinned by the work that we've been doing in the Research into Practice research group here at the University of Hertfordshire over the last 10 years or so. And we think this is going to be relevant for you for 2 main reasons. First of all, you're undertaking a professional doctorate. This is a relatively new concept that aims to bridge the gap that traditionally exists between academic research on the one hand, the kind of theory production, theorization that goes on in universities, and applied research that is usually done in the professional workplace, often under the title of research and development, R&D, which has an objective of increasing productivity, innovation, things with material outcomes. And these 2 areas have very different foci, and perhaps as a result have developed different theories explaining how they are connected, how knowledge is produced, how the activities that they're doing relates to the intellectual productivity of the activity. We think it's also relevant to you for a second reason, that the area that you're working in fine art, design, but also potentially in architecture and music, these areas are creative areas. And so the whole idea of what it is to produce knowledge is somewhat different from the traditional scientific model. So much of the literature that you're going to be engaging with, and the history of knowledge production and explaining how knowledge production occurs, is based on a scientific model that these creative areas do not share. So simplifying matters considerably for a moment, we could say the objective of scientific research is to find an underlying truth, to try and explain how the world really is, how it works. But there's no corresponding truth, no corresponding underlying, perhaps hidden nature in the creative areas. When we look at something like the Mona Lisa, we are not trying to find out what is this really about. The most we can think is, what does this mean to us today? Or perhaps what did it mean at the time of its production? So there's a cultural relativity involved in creative research that perhaps doesn't exist in scientific research. So these 2 foci of the professional doctorate, the fact that the professional doctorate is focusing on the professional area rather than the academic area, and the fact that the topic you are researching is creative rather than scientific, both of these could present barriers to benefiting from the body of knowledge that exists in libraries and that you're going to have access to, because of a lack of apparent transferability. And we hope that this theory we're going to present will help to bridge that gap. So let's go back to this apparent difference between academic research on one hand and practical applied research on the other. At one extreme, we can think they are completely different. So academic research concentrates on theory, perhaps has a basis in philosophy, theory of ideas, and practical research is about getting things done. How do we make something better? How do we make something faster? How do we create the next generation? And so the concepts are different, and the means that we're going to employ are different. Now, one side, that presents them as being very different. Of course, we could account for them being much more similar, and we could find a scale between extreme difference and extreme synergy between these two objectives. And in describing practice-based research, as it's often called, these researches that lie between the academic and the purely professional research, we see degrees of overlap. Now, ideally, I think we want to reach a point where we can identify the core that these two areas have in common. But we'll see whether we can get there. Thinking of this as a spectrum, we can describe this relationship in a number of ways. We could see research and practice. We can see research versus practice, a tension between the two. And we can see research with practice, a joining. So we've got them separately, we've got them in contestation, and we've got them in a degree of integration. If we're thinking for a moment about the two somewhat separately, can we find a vocabulary for mapping one onto the other? Well, I think there is a good degree of parallel, even if we think that their focus and their objectives are noticeably different. On the one hand, we've got a professional concern, which corresponds to the practical issue of what are you curious about? We've got what might be termed in research structuring concepts, which is a formalization of the practical business of asking, well, who would know about my research problem? Formalizing a research question is basically formalizing the everyday question of what is it that you want to know? And methods, which often seem rather mysterious, is basically answering the question, how could you find out? Now, if on the other hand we wish to express this or investigate this in ways that reveal the differences, the potential tensions between research and practice, I think there are some other words that we could concentrate on, focus on. So, for example, there seems to be a considerable difference between the concepts of knowledge on the one hand and experience on the other. In these diagrams, by the way, the green represents the world of practice, the grey represents the world of academia. There seems to be a difference here between what we mean by these words and therefore a certain degree of incompatibility. In the world of practice, particularly in the creative studio, we value intuition, serendipity, creative ideas that pretty much come out of nowhere or come out of experience. And on the other hand, the concepts of evidence, something a bit more objective, something colder that we can point to. The world of practice is characterized by action, by doing, by physical intervention. In the academic context, characterized perhaps by reflection, by thought, by introspection. By almost the opposite, by a lack of action, perhaps. Being related to experience and intuition and so on, practical activity is characterized as having personal outcomes, outcomes that I experience, outcomes that are particular to my situation. But academic knowledge aims to create generalizable, transferable information. And perhaps again we've got the idea of creation, a core word in the area of practice, as opposed to transmission and communication related to the generalizability of academic knowledge. Both, of course, produce artifacts. Artifacts, though, of different kinds. In the world of practice, we are perhaps interested in an actual object of production or a series of actions, whereas the artifact in academic research is likely to be a document, a lecture, a series of ideas that are communicated. Now, the integration of academic research with practice is being attempted in various centres around the world, and not just because they are in different universities or different centres of research, but also because they are located in different countries and cultural contexts. The exact nature and the nuances of the relationship between research and practice vary from one country to another. And so you will find different names, such as practice-based research, arts-based research, practice as research, and so on, which attempt to encapsulate, well, what is the exact relationship? What is the linkage that's going on here between research and practice? So practice-based research perhaps reflects the idea of rooting knowledge production in activity. Arts-based research focuses even more on the fact that in this area we're looking at art production rather than something else. Practice-based research can exist in a number of areas. Practice-based research can be a description of medical research, for example. Surgery is advanced through practice-based research. Practice as research is a claim by some communities that the business of doing is itself research. So this actually turns attention away from the bridging that we are trying to do here at the University of Hertfordshire between concepts of academic research and concepts of practice. And a practice as research moves the debate by claiming new territory, a new understanding simply for practice itself. And so we could unpack these different descriptions and concepts and come to an understanding of the subtle differences between these relationships that exist in different academic and cultural communities around the world. And in the literature you will find some of the disagreements and debates about how this all works can be interpreted as having different cultural contexts and understandings driving them. And it creates a certain amount of disagreement amongst communities because they are coming from different conceptual traditions. So we have these different relationships. Let's try and unpack this relationship, or at least represent it in one diagram, where practice can generate, on the one hand, a series of questions and themes that are then treated using traditional academic methods. So the role of practice is to generate the questions, and on the other hand, claims that the world of practice is actually where we will find the methods and the approaches and the techniques for answering these questions. So in the first condition, on the left of the diagram, the questions and themes, practice only serves to generate issues that can really be treated using traditional academic research methods. And the more radical claim on the right-hand side is perhaps more like the claim of the practice as research community, that no, practice is going to be where the solution lies. We don't need to step outside into the traditional areas of academic research. Now, we think somewhere in the middle actually is really where the meat in the sandwich lies. but we need to explain this relationship. And the relationship between questions and how questions are answered is a problem in all areas of research. This isn't a problem just for practice-based research. Academic research has a difficulty, which is represented by the philosophical skepticism, of accounting for how it is that actions or real-world situations can account for answers to problems. How do we get to a causal understanding of a problem? How do we demonstrate, how do we prove that this causes that this is the answer to that? So let's try and extract from this some general notions of research and explain research, account for research as an activity in ways that are compatible, that are user-friendly for both communities, both the academic research community, the traditional research community, the more scientifically based communities on the one hand, and the practice communities, the professional communities, the work context on the other hand. So research, I think, starts with a question. It is a directed activity. So it doesn't just start with a question, it states a goal. We've got an idea of a starting point and we've got an idea of going somewhere. It's a transition, it's a progression from a state of unknowing to a state of knowing. In order to achieve a goal, one requires a plan. Trying to keep this in the most generalized terms that we can, the least problematic terms. It uses measurable data. Now this perhaps sounds a little more problematic, particularly in creative areas, but what we mean here is that it uses information and resources in pursuit of an answer to the question that we can point to, that we can share. So measurable here, we don't necessarily mean that we can measure it in units, but that we can point to it, that it's something that's, that we can share with others, and we can agree, yes, this data here informs our answer to the problem, informs our pursuit of the question. And it calls for critical analysis. It's not enough just to come up with a solution, but we need to be able to account for the way in which our data contributes to achieving our goal. So it's explanatory. It isn't just result-oriented. So let's try putting this one step further. It's a systematic inquiry. What we had were a number of linked concepts in the previous slide. So we're looking at a systematic inquiry based on a plan. It's focused on a specific issue. It's not a ramble, it's not a walk in the park, it's trying to achieve our goal. It's objective in the philosophical sense of objective as opposed to subjective, so it uses information that we can share with others so that we can debate about the success or otherwise of our research activity. It can be communicated explicitly. It doesn't rely just on my personal interpretation and feelings about what's going on. And it leads to the production of new knowledge, a problematic term perhaps, but let's unpack that a little bit later on. So I think out of this we can extract a general description of research that is compatible with our objectives on the Professional Doctorate programme. Research takes knowledge, concepts and methods from anywhere as long as it's justified and argued for over others, and applies them in a practical way to a particular problem through rigorous and systematic procedures, and clearly demonstrates what was done. And we will use this concept as what we mean by research. This is an underpinning description in all of our descriptions of research in these lectures and on the programme as a whole. This is what we mean by research in the context of the professional doctorate. Now, each of these lectures will end with a few recommended readings, and you should find links to online versions of these papers and book chapters on StudyNet. So where you clicked on the lecture, you should also find links to these online texts. So they're all accessible to you if you're working at a distance from the university campus itself.